I'm John Law, this is Chasing Cars, and behind me is the new 2021 Hyundai Sonata. And in today's video, we're going to check out how it drives, how it looks, and what it's like inside the cabin. So in its 8th generation form, the Hyundai Sonata actually rather belies its conservative name tag. Back when I was in school, a mate's dad had a Hyundai Sonata. It was a burgundy one, and hilariously, he was a cellist and he played in an orchestra, which meant he played lots of sonatas. Now, he chose that car because it was affordable, reliable, and pretty conservative. And conservative is not something you can say about this new car styling, because frankly, it's pretty mad. From the front, that grille kind of looks like a disgruntled wobbegong shark, and there's these amazing details in the LED running lights that dissolve into the chrome strips really nicely that wrap around the cabin, and I think it looks fantastic. But of course, looks are pretty subjective, so you can let me know in the comment section down below what you think, but in N Line trim, this car definitely has some serious road presence. Now in today's video, we're going to do our usual thing where we jump inside the cabin, take a look at the practicalities and the technology in there, and then we're going to take this Hyundai Sonata N Line out for a drive and see if the new sportier Sonata is worth considering amongst its rivals. So we're inside the cabin of the Sonata, and it's a really nice place to be. Now the N Line here in Australia is pretty loaded up with stuff. We don't get any of the base models, so it's pretty much, fully loaded. It means you get a 10.25-inch screen here, which runs an Android-based software, and it works really nicely. Now, the bigger screen means that you have to use a wire for using Apple CarPlay, which is a little bit annoying, but really it's not the biggest deal in the world. There's plenty of USB ports to go around. There's also wireless charging as well, so you can charge plenty of phones at the same time. And the Apple CarPlay, when you're listening to your own music, is rendered really nicely through a Bose stereo. Now, what else have we got going on? Well, below that, we've got climate control dials, which are quite new to me. They're not that similar to any other Hyundai products I've been in before, and I quite like them. You've got these really nice, simple to understand, digitized temperature controls here, simple fan controls, and works really nicely. You've also got heating for the steering wheel that you access through there, and heated and cooled front seats, which is always a nice touch, and I love to see Hyundai including cooled seats in a hot country like Australia. Now, speaking of seats, they are a really nice item actually. They've got really generous bolstering, and they've got Alcantara-ish, or rather suede cloth centers with a little bit of leather as well on the outsides, and they hold you in very well indeed. You're not going to be slipping out of the seats, which is great for me, but if you're a larger person, you may run into some issues, so it's definitely worth going and testing one in a dealership. Now, what else have we got in here? A 12.3-inch digital driver's display ahead of me here, which is nice, crisp, and gives you all the information you need, but it doesn't have the advanced software capabilities that something like a Volkswagen does. So say in something like a Volkswagen Passat, you can get 3D mapping up, which you can't do in this car, but you do get the rather cool inclusion of something we first saw in a Kia Sorento, and that's the blind spot cameras that pop up when you pop your indicators on in either the tachometer or in the speedo. It's all great stuff, really. There are a couple of gripes I'd like to point out though, mainly to do with plastics and build quality. Firstly, this indicator stalk is a little bit creaky. I'm not sure if you can hear that on the microphone, but every time you just touch it, it has a little bit of a creak to it, which is kind of a little bit annoying. Well, this is a fairly early build car. The other thing is there's not that much soft touch plastic. You've got quite a lot of hard touch here and where your knee rests, but to be fair, everywhere else you touch is really rather nice, including this lovely center armrest that is leather appointed. This leather appointed steering wheel, which feels just right in the hands. It's not a 3-spoke item, it's the 4-spoke wheel that we first saw in Australia on the Hyundai i30 sedan, but it is a little bit sportier. You've got perforated leather, and the steering wheel is lifted nicely with this little bit of red stitching and the N badging down the bottom. Overall, the ambience of the interior is fairly sporty as well. It's very black. You can't opt for anything like a cream white interior or anything like that. It feels nicely elevated with a little bit of red stitching that also appears on the seats as well. And then practicality is pretty decent. You've got 2 cup holders in the middle here, a little spot for your phone or your wallet, and then of course the tray ahead of your shifter with the 12 volt as well as the other USB ports, a nice deep center bin, and door bins which are just big enough to squeeze sort of a 700ml bottle, and they're flexible, which means that it holds the bottle really rather nicely. So overall then, the Sonata is actually a really nice place to be, and Hyundai have done a good job of making it just sporty enough without it being over the top. So let's jump in the back seat and see how practical this sedan is. So jumping into the back seat of the Sonata, and you really don't feel like you've been relegated to sitting in the back seat back here. at least on the two outboard seats. Now behind my own driving position at 6'2", I've got plenty of knee room and I've got a really decent amount of toe room as well. As for headroom, the sunroof does eat into that a little bit, but I am fairly comfortable and I'm fairly tall for a back seat. So anyone who's shorter than me is going to have absolutely no issue back here. And yeah, you've got a great view out. You can sit just proud of the front driver's seat, which is really nice, so you're unlikely to get car sick. And you have a bunch of amenities back here as well, starting with air vents, which is something we'd really expect, and a USB charging port as well. Both are great things, but on top of that, you also get heating for both of the outboard seats, two-stage heating as well, which is a really nice little touch to keep your rear passengers warm on a cold winter's day, and it would make this car a really nice little rideshare proposition. What else have we got back here? Also got these sun blinds for the outboard windows, and you've got the big sun blind, which is electrically operated from the front seat, which reminds me of a maybe 90s BMW 5 Series. It's got kind of a little bit of that vibe back there. And yeah, materials are all nice back here. Keeps on with the leather and suede cloth material mix back here. You probably get held in pretty well through the corners, and you also get a really sturdy feeling armrest with two cup holders. If I was going to level one criticism at the Sonata in the back, it's the door pockets, but it's not a really big deal given you have two decent cup holders here anyway, and you've also got some springy nets to hold any extra stuff you have lying around. So all in all, it's a really practical car and it would be really good for a family of four. Now let's jump around the boot and see how much luggage this sedan can carry. So we come around to the rear end of the Sonata where the rather nice design continues. It's very angular and it has a lot of the design cues that you saw in the i30 Sedan N Line that we tested a little while ago. The N Line obviously gets a lot more black plastic because that seems to be a sporty thing, and I know Ponch will love that, but we do still have the chrome around the windowsill to sort of make it feel a little bit classier. Now in the rest of the world you get the base model Sonata, but here in Australia it's just one level, the N Line, for just a little over $50,000 plus own-road costs, and honestly I think it looks fantastic. The design is really cool. You've got this full-width LED rear light bar which looks great in my book, and you also get this really nice little touch where to open the boot you actually press inside the Hyundai logo, which is just a nice little detail, and it keeps the boot lid sparse and really nice and tidy. Now under that boot lid you get 510 litres of space, which is exactly 20 litres more than you get in a VE Commodore. So there's a nice little comparison for you, and that means it's a really big and quite useful space. Now I know Hyundai is quite bullish in that the Sonata is going to be enough to take sales off an SUV customer, but obviously with a sedan you're going to run into a few issues in terms of practicality, that being a pretty high load lip, and the boot space isn't quite as practical as something you'd get in like a Santa Fe or something like that. But it is very big on absolute space. So as I said, 510 litres, big storage cubbies off to the side, a fairly nice square load bay, and you've got these nice little pull tabs here so you can reach in and drop the seats without having to jump into the back seat itself. But apart from that, there's not too much going on here. There's no nets or cargo hooks or anything like that. So it's a boot that is pretty on par with competitors like the Mazda 6 and Toyota Camry. But as I said, perhaps not quite as practical as something like an SUV. And of course, under the boot floor, we do just have a space saver spare tyre, not a full-size spare that you might expect in something like an old school Commodore. All right, let's take this Hyundai Sonata N Line out for a spin on the road. So let's talk about driving the Sonata N Line. Now, it's actually quite an interesting vehicle because it brings a couple of things to Australia that we haven't sampled before. One of those is the 2.5 litre turbocharged engine that is first appearing in the Sonata. And it's well matched to the rest of the class, so outputs of 213 kilowatts of power and 422 newton meters of torque, and that handily bests cars like the Volkswagen Passat 206 TSI and also the Mazda 6 GTSP and the Atenza with the turbo 2.5. So it's pretty much the quickest in class. It's not too heavy either at about 1,540 kilos for this N Line variant. It's not a real porker for the size of the car, but that said, it doesn't feel lithe and light on its feet in quite the same way, say, the i30 Sedan N Line does. Now, back to that engine, because it's a really nicely polished piece of kit, actually. It's got great mid-range, and it sounds quite good too. Now there's a lot of fakery going on in terms of the active sound design. We've just got it in normal at the moment. You can turn that off. And the engine actually still sounds really good with the active sound design off, at least in my opinion. And I frankly don't love the fakery, but you know, I totally get why someone would like it because it does add a little bit of meatiness to that note of the engine and makes this car feel just that little bit more sporty, which is always nice. Now, when you run the engine up to redline, the response is still pretty good, though it doesn't feel quite as tack sharp as it does in, say, the i30N, which is a fully fledged N product. Now, we're not expecting a full N car to be made on the Sonata platform yet, at least. And if it did, it would definitely have to be a car with all-wheel drive, because at the moment, this car is right at the limit of what the front-wheel drive power delivery can handle, at least in my book. You do get quite a lot of torque steer. There's no limited slip differential in this car either. So yeah, when you hit boost in third, it really sort of tries to grab the wheel out of your hands. Not such a bad thing most of the time, and when you're rolling, you get really good power delivery, but if you're trying to get away quickly from the lights, you'll notice that the front tires will spin very easily. Now, we can't talk about the engine without talking about fuel economy, so we're going to jump outside the car quickly and have a little chat about that and other running costs associated with owning a Sonata N Line. So let's talk about how much it's going to cost to run a Hyundai Sonata N Line. As for fuel, it takes 91 RON fuel here in Australia, and it does take E10 as well, but we did return a fairly poor fuel consumption of about 10 litres per 100 Ks. Now, it was in a pretty condensed testing environment, so quite a lot of full throttle application, and you probably expect to get a little bit lower than that in the real world. Hyundai claims about 8.1 litres per 100 Ks, but that's something we'll find out when we get a little bit more time in this car in the future. As for servicing, we don't have data on that yet, and it's the same story for insurance. Now, the other new thing the Sonata N Line has brought to us for a bit of an early glimpse, although we know Tom's already driven the 8-speed DCT and the i30N, is an 8-speed dual clutch gearbox, which works really nicely in this car. It's quite relaxed in the way it's tuned. It's not quite as sharp as a sportier DSG gearbox would be, or rather dual clutch gearbox would be, but I think that really fits the purpose of this car, and it's well sorted so that when you're creeping around town and maneuvering this car, it's not intrusive either, which is a really big thing, and it shows that Hyundai has really upped their game in terms of gearbox development, because this is an in-house gearbox like all of Hyundai's gearboxes, so that's pretty cool. Now let's talk about the chassis as well, because the Sonata is a pretty big vehicle. It's not small, it's not as light or as lithe as an i30 sedan, and this N Line is obviously not supposed to be quite as sporty as a full-fledged N product. And that's exactly what Hyundai has managed to achieve with this car. It's got a really nice flow to it on a country road with nice open corners. You can really get into a nice steady gait in this car. It doesn't feel too sharp or too relaxed in the way it goes about its business. As I said, super nice balance. The other interesting thing about the Sonata N Line is that it doesn't have an Australian-specific suspension tune. This is the global tune that the Australian engineers decided was absolutely good enough for our roads, and I can echo that statement. I think it's a really well set up car. There's a little bit of float, which you would expect for something that's still trying to be comfortable and suitable for everyone, but there's also a little bit of around town harshness, but I think that's from the fairly large 19-inch alloy wheels, and it's not a bother once you're up above 50 k's an hour. And the trade-off of that slightly firm suspension tune is that the car sits super flat in corners. It doesn't roll too much, there's no adaptive dampers to play with either, there's only drive modes that adjust throttle response, gearbox response, and sound. But you don't need that. It just feels really well set up and like quite a sorted chassis in this car. Now, coming back to drive modes, there are 4 to choose from. So you've got custom, which you can set up to whatever you like, which is a great thing that Hyundai has always done in their sportier products, and it's great to see it crop up again on the Sonata N Line. You've also got sport and normal, both of which are pretty good, and then you've got Sport Plus as well, which has a launch control function, which we're not going to test today because doing it on a busy road that we're driving today would be not the greatest thing to do. I think you'd get some looks, but it works really well. It manages traction extremely well and allows this car to get off the line much quicker than you'd expect for a front-wheel drive car with 422 Newton meters. The best mode I found to drive in is either Sport Plus or normal, at least in my book. Sport Plus is great, and Sport 2, because they hold your manual gear choices, which you make with the paddles behind the steering wheel. Normal defaults back to automatic after about 30 seconds, and the gearbox tune in terms of what the automatic gearbox does isn't perhaps quite as polished as, say, a Volkswagen product, but it's not bad. And you can just give a little flare of the throttle when you're driving around town just to get it to kick down a couple of gears if you need to. Now let's talk about safety as well, because the Sonata N Line is really well kitted out in that sense as well. So you've got all the stuff you expect. So adaptive cruise control with stop and go, you've got lane departure warning, you've got lane trace assist, and you've also got AEB with forward, rear and junction capability with both pedestrian and cyclist detection as well. So I think the Sonata N Line is actually a really well sorted out car. It's not quite as enthusiastic as a full-fledged end product would be, but then it's not supposed to be. It's got a really nice balance of everyday usability, comfort and the sportiness, and a really handy amount of power from that 2.5 litre engine. So what do we think of the 2021 Hyundai Sonata? Has it been worth the wait? Well, I think so. In 8th generation, in N Line guise, this sedan is a really fun car to drive. It's got plenty of grunt and it's quite a refined package overall. Is it enough to tempt buyers out of SUVs? I think it might just be. And if Hyundai's order books are anything to go by, it sounds like it's going to be a bit of a hit in Australia. But you can let me know in the comment section down below what you think of the Hyundai Sonata N Line and whether you'd take this over an SUV counterpart like a Hyundai Santa Fe or a Tucson. While you're down there leaving a comment, we'd also love it if you could hit subscribe and the bell icon. And as always, thank you for watching Chasing Cars.